Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Zafar, and I am the outgoing student body president at Roosevelt High School in Des Moines, Iowa. Alongside my co-moderator, Ellie Miglin, I'd like to welcome you all to the sixth and final session of our Student Council's Youth Voice Forums, a series that aims to connect youth with bipartisan elected officials, political figures, and community leaders. What a series it has been. On June 8th, all of you had the unique opportunity to connect with Senator Charles Grassley, the President pro tempore of the United States Senate. Then on June 10th, we heard from former Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, alongside former First Lady of Iowa, Kristi Vilsack. On June 12th, we heard from Eric Branstad, a current advisor for the Trump Victory Committee and the Iowa director of Donald Trump's 2016 presidential campaign. On Monday, you connected with Janice Rottenberg, the Iowa director for Elizabeth Warren's 2020 presidential campaign. And on Wednesday, we spoke with Huff Cooksey, the former manager for Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds' 2018 campaign. Today, you'll have the ability to engage with our final two speakers, Misty Rebik, the Iowa director for Bernie Sanders' 2020 campaign, and Michael Fasullo, the Sanders campaign's Iowa field director. As part of this Q&A, scheduled from 3 to 4 p.m. Central Time, students will have the opportunity to ask questions about issues that matter to them from their own perspective. We hope that you seek inspiration from our speakers' words and that you become politically aware and civically engaged as a result. Today, as many of you know, is the 155th anniversary of Juneteenth, a very important day in our nation's history, as it was on this day in 1865 when Union soldiers were able to finally declare the end of slavery in Texas, the farthest and most isolated southern state at the time, an action that would fortify the Emancipation Proclamation passed in 1863. As we all know too well, this day was one of the first in a long journey that we still find ourselves a part of, to ensure equality for African Americans, Indigenous Americans, and other Americans of all races, faiths, and creeds. It is times like this when we must recognize the great effort that has been undertaken by generations before us to ensure that the right to vote exists for all. And in these moments, we must remind ourselves of the importance of getting out and voting to make ourselves heard. Please register to vote if you haven't done so yet. You're eligible to vote if you'll turn 18 before November 3rd of this year. And if you aren't eligible, try to get at least one other person to do so. That is the easiest and most significant way to make a difference. Now it's my privilege to pass the mic to my co-host, Senior Student Council member Ellie Miglin, to introduce today's guests, Misty Rebik and Michael Fasullo.
Thank you, Fez. Before I introduce today's amazing speakers, I would like to quickly thank today's sponsors: CLE Productions based in Des Moines, Iowa, Sight for Smiles and Smarts, the College and Young Democrats of Iowa, and of course, the Roosevelt Student Council. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct privilege to welcome Misty Rebik and Michael Fasullo as today's guests. Let me first introduce Ms. Rebik. A graduate of the University of Iowa, Misty Rebik has immersed herself in grassroots activism for several years. She previously served as the executive director for the Center for Worker Justice of Eastern Iowa, an organization that represents low-wage workers by fighting for improvements in rights and privileges, workplace conditions, and more. Ms. Rebik then joined One Iowa, a group that seeks to establish equality for Iowa-based members of the LGBTQ+ community. She entered the political realm after being asked by Nurse and Union President Kathy Glosson to serve as the manager for her 2018 campaign for governor of Iowa. Under Ms. Rebik's leadership, the campaign would exceed polling expectations by accumulating over 36,000 votes in the Democratic primary. Unfortunately, this would be second place to businessman Fred Hubbell, who would become the nominee. Nonetheless, Ms. Rebik's experience in the 2018 race would be crucial in preparing her for the most valuable role of her career. In 2019, upon launching his second campaign for president, Senator Bernie Sanders asked Ms. Rebik to serve as the director of his Iowa-based campaign, a position in which Ms. Rebik would assume oversight of a diverse array of volunteers and staffers engaged in communications, organizing, and more. Our second guest today served as one of those campaign officials. As a former organizer with the Service Employees International Union, Mr. Michael Fasullo has also had significant experience in grassroots efforts. In the past, Mr. Fasullo has worked in campaigns across the Midwest. In 2015, he would guide the City Council campaign for progressive candidate Carlos Ramirez Rosa in an election that would result in victory. Mr. Fasullo also has experience in Pennsylvania, where his leadership helped one Pennsylvania State House district flip from red to blue. In 2019, Mr. Fasullo was also asked by the Sanders campaign to serve as its Iowa field director, one of the most crucial roles in a grassroots campaign that oversaw many thousands of volunteers mobilized across Iowa and the rest of the country. In his position, Mr. Fasullo worked to form strategies that would enact potential supporters of the campaign. As the final months of the Iowa caucus campaign showed, these efforts would be largely successful. After a tumultuous and historic primary, the leadership of Ms. Rebik and Mr. Fasullo would result in Senator Sanders receiving the highest number of popular votes on caucus night by over 2,000, and a second place finish in number of accumulated delegates by 0.1%. This would propel the Sanders campaign with added momentum throughout the first few states of the primary, an energy that brought victories in New Hampshire and Nevada, the two states that followed Iowa. While Vice President Joe Biden would ultimately win the primary, the efforts of Ms. Rebik and Mr. Fasullo undoubtedly played a role in pushing the Sanders campaign forward. Today, they join us to provide their perspective of the behind-the-scenes experience, advice for students interested in grassroots activism or the civic process, and insight on today's political realm. Ms. Rebik and Mr. Fasullo, all of us here at Roosevelt Student Council are immensely grateful for your time today, and we thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. So, why don't we dive into our first question? This one will come from me. As Ellie said, this caucus process was truly historic, not only in the number of candidates, but all the way up to caucus night itself. So would you mind just each of you kind of explaining what was your experience like, from start to finish when you entered that campaign all the way until, however many weeks afterward when I think finally the results were finalized?
Sure. Well, let me just start though by saying thanks everybody, and thank you for having me and Michael on. Very excited to share experiences from the Iowa campaign. And I just want to also acknowledge today as Juneteenth, which I believe should be a federal holiday. And thank you for your comments in the beginning about the history of this important day. So thanks for hosting this, and just want to acknowledge that before we get into this. So just to answer your question, Fez, I mean, being the campaign manager, essentially, the Iowa State Director for what would end up being, I think, one of the largest presidential staffs ever in the state of Iowa in history. We ended up having over 350 people on staff at the end, and invested heavily into multiple organizing programs that I'll let Michael talk about. But, starting from the very beginning, I was like one of the first hires back in March of 2019. And then, Michael was one of the very first hires I made. And Michael and I actually had the opportunity to work on the Kathy Glosson campaign. So this was our second time doing a caucus together. I could not have expected that it would change me as a person and as a leader so much. Having the opportunity to work with what I really truly believe is some of the most talented people from all across the country dedicated to transforming our country for the better, and doing it in my home state. I'm born and raised in Iowa. Was incredible. And we just built this campaign, like I said, from a few of us in the beginning to we ended up just being this humongous team at the end. And there was a lot of bad days, but there's a lot of good days. And when I say bad days, I mean, in the campaign world, it is tough. You get up every day, you do your best. You have long days. There's very few days off. And, what I would often tell the staff is, I don't expect you to get up every day and do a 360 in terms of being better, but just if you wake up every day and do 1% better than we did yesterday, that's the goal, right? Just every day, just coming in and doing just a little bit better than we did the day before. And our team, I believe, did that. And so over, you know, the summer was, you know, we were a smaller team. We probably had like 30 people on staff, and just through the fall we grew and just kept growing and growing. And we did 110 events with the senator in the state of Iowa, which Michael helped plan and execute. And I also helped plan and execute and work closely with the senator on. So, you know, it is like, I remember when we were doing countdowns and we were down to the last 2 or 3 months, it was just kind of, you couldn't believe it, right? That it was going to be caucus day. And then, you know, then the virtual caucus, and then we got to do the caucuses outside of the actual caucus night location. And so our team actually was able to go caucus together on the day of caucus. And we went to the Drake University caucus and got to just, you know, win. We got to win our precinct together. And, you know, we were live on CNN, and it was just a very exciting day. And we had done lots of scenario planning for all the different scenarios that we think could have happened that day. And the one scenario we did not plan for was to not get the results. So we, you know, so what we didn't know is that we were actually in line for another 4 or 5 days of just trying to rally the troops and the volunteers and the staff to just be on the phones trying to chase down those caucus results. But we were really proud of the operation we put together. You know, a couple of things I'll just share. You know, we won 43% of the people of color vote. We increased youth turnout by 30%. We had over 5,000 caucus volunteers in our program. You know, and just to double down a little bit for the young folks watching, you know, out of the precincts with 20% of registered voters or more of people age 18 to 23, we won 13 out of those 15 precincts. So we had a really deliberate program. We were very, very invested in doing transformational organizing instead of transactional, meaning we really wanted to build long-term power and infrastructure in the communities that we were organizing in. And, you know, we didn't get a full win. As you heard, we tallied up those delegate percentages to the best we could, and we ended up just 0.1% behind Buttigieg. But we did win the popular vote. And we're really proud of that. And it was honestly the time of my life to lead that campaign. So I'll turn it over to Michael.
Yeah. So I'll just say a little bit, because I know we're short for time, and Misty did a good job of explaining. First, I just want to say thank you for those backgrounds and your research on those things. I think you're really showing up for Gen Z, you know, having that internet sort of talent to look at those things. But I'll just say, you know, what I'm most proud of, and I'm interested in getting to know some of the folks on this call more, and what's, you know, folks are really interested in, what would be helpful for them. But I think we strove to do something really different. And I remember coming on board and saying we wanted to build a revolutionary field program, one that met voters where they were. And I remember when we first started, I said, in order to win this thing, I think we'll need to knock 1 million doors. And we came quite close. We ended up knocking around 800,000 doors in the state. We made over 12 million voter contact attempts. So basically, we attempted to talk to folks around 12 million times, which is just unheard of. And the way we were able to do that, and if there's time on this call, I'd love to get more into it, but was just asking people to step up in regular ways, asking nurses, asking regular working folks to plug into a visionary campaign that they believed in, and to allow those folks to do that. So really, really exciting. Misty hit the bases, and excited to dig in more.
Great. So our first question comes from Isabelle, a rising junior at Roosevelt High School.
Hi, I'm Isabelle. I've been involved in the Bernie Sanders campaign for a long time. I was actually a high school intern on the campaign in the last couple of months. So my question is just, youth organizing and training was really at the center of the Bernie campaign from the beginning. So what was so important about youth organizing to the Bernie campaign, and how does that play into like the wide range of different grassroots movements and organizations and campaigns?
I'll just say I'll say one thing really briefly, and I'll hand this one over to Michael. I will say that it sort of starts with the top here. You know, our candidate, the senator, you've heard him say many times that he believes that you know, this generation, your generation, is the most progressive generation we've seen in decades. And we were committed to investing in this generation because we truly believe you are the future of this country. You understand climate, the climate crisis that we're facing more than any other generation. You've lived through economic crises already, the 2008 crash, which many people, you know, saw their parents lose their homes during that. We are facing student debt. I'm actually in that with you, and many of these things with you guys. But there's no one else who's facing that more than us, right? You know, we are also going to be, your generation is going to be the most diverse generation we've seen in this country. So, you know, our campaign is committed to building a movement of everyday people, and that includes young people, because young people are the future of this country. And you know, as cliche as that is, we knew we couldn't do this without young people, without the energy of young people, without the clarity of young people, without how passionate and how articulate your generation is in terms of understanding the global issues that we're facing as a country. And I think really wanting real solutions and sort of being kind of done with like the nibbling on the edges stuff. So Senator Sanders understands that. I work with the senator still. I'm his executive director for his Senate campaign now. And we talk about young people all the time. Young people are crucial as we're facing all the different things we're seeing in the streets right now, from Black Lives Matter to how we're gonna tackle this pandemic and change our country through those things. So we were committed to investing in young people and making them the center of this campaign.
Right. And I'll just piggyback off that on the last thing that Misty said, which is, you know, not only are young people, so just for full transparency, I'm 25, I'm a millennial, so you say, you know, one of the things that I'm just noticing in this moment, and we knew coming into the Bernie Sanders campaign, is that we're actually seeing more moral courage and more moral clarity from young people than we are from the old guard that's in place. I have been so frustrated. I'm still in Des Moines, seeing our city councilors, seeing our government, seeing our president, but it's not just our president and our Republican governor, it's actually our Democratic leadership that actually isn't doing much leading. And what we're actually seeing is folks like you, Fez, folks like you, Ellie, and other folks on this call. Isabelle, you were involved in the campaign, is actually showing up in more courageous ways than the folks that are, quote unquote, in power. So we knew that. And one of the things that was so frustrating to me, being a millennial, is I think a lot of campaigns and a lot of people talk about youth organizing or student organizing, and they almost look at it like a mythical box, right? They're like, what do we do to get these young people out? You know, how do we engage young people? And you see these just, you know, flops happening over and over with folks, when the reality is people just, you know, high schoolers, folks that just graduated high school or had to drop out of high school for X, Y, and Z reason, have the same issues that need to be talked about on the national platform that, you know, most folks have. And to engage people in a way, you know, that just sort of superficially covered those things was going to be wrong. So you're right. We invested heavily in turning out high schoolers to the caucus, something that most campaigns didn't do. We had presences on a majority of a ton of high schools actually statewide, including also you know, your big universities. But we actually wanted to focus more on high schools and more on community colleges than most sort of, you know, what U of I and ISU, most campaigns look at, because we know that young people are not just at your big, you know, sort of university or college. They're at your community college. They're at your high school. There might not even be at those things because they dropped out because these issues are so prevalent in our lives and in your lives.
Sure, wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Isabelle, for asking that question. Our next question will come from Juan Carlos. He just graduated from North High School in Des Moines and plans to attend Iowa State University in the fall.
Yeah, so I also volunteered for the Bernie campaign. And my question is, why did each of you choose to associate with the Bernie campaign, and what motivated you two to accept your positions?
You want to go first, Michael? Okay.
Well, I can go first.
Okay, you go first.
You know, for me, and I'm so glad we have folks that volunteered on our campaign on this call. You know, for me, it's just deeply personal. So I'm a gay person. I'm a queer person in the LGBTQ community. And I grew up in a very conservative family in Delaware, and I moved to Chicago. When I was 18, I went to school in Chicago. I did SEIU organizing, and went to after school and I did a whole bunch of other organizing and moved out here to Iowa. But I wasn't out until I was a senior in college. And actually, I remember most of the reason I came out was actually for Bernie Sanders. And, you know, that story sounds cliche, but it was so true. I had spent years and years feeling very voiceless and very powerless in my own sort of community, having to go to church every Sunday, being, you know, existing in a world where my family didn't know who I really was and didn't actually believe in LGBTQ existence. And so I remember it was my senior year of college that Bernie first ran. And I remember watching, you know, it was so exciting to see somebody that was championing issues boldly and proudly and speaking about them with clarity. But not only that, it was so encouraging to see masses of people do the same thing. So we watched it in the summer of 2015 as he had rallies in Phoenix and Portland, in Milwaukee, and thousands of people joined him. And I remember watching those things and watching as people would get up on that same stage and say their story and say why they were unapologetically, you know, not afraid to speak their truths, whether it was being undocumented, whether it was being saddled with that, whether it was police violence, or whether it was being a gay person or a trans person living in our society. And I remember him winning, I call it a win in Iowa in 2016, but we all know it as a tie, and then going on to New Hampshire and winning. And then we went into Super Tuesday in 16. I was not with the campaign, but we went into the Super Tuesday in 16. We lost a bunch of states. And around, you know, the first week of March, we went into Michigan, and nobody thought that he would win Michigan, and he ended up winning Michigan. And so for me, and 2 days after that, I came out to my parents and my family. And for me, it was this feeling of, you know, we have the power now. We can overcome all of these odds. And I don't know for folks on this call, your own personal experiences, I bet you probably struggle with something, but there's a moment in your life where you break those chains and you are able to see clearly and unapologetically what your truth is and who you are. And for me, that was so representative in what this campaign was trying to do, that there was no other fit. You know, we can speak a lot about the sort of flaws of electoral organizing and the limits and the constraints, but for me, it was more than that. And I was just so proud and honored to be a part of this. And when the opportunity came up, I jumped for joy at it. So that's a little bit about me. I'll pass it back to Misty.
Yeah, so I was born and raised in Iowa, grew up on a working class farm just north of Grinnell, actually. And I have been a community organizer, actually, most of my life. I started I cut my teeth in organizing with Iowa CCI, Iowa Citizens for Community Improvement. If you don't know them, you should look them up. They're one of the longest standing grassroots organizing groups in the country, and is really committed to one of my values, which is that everyday people who are directly affected by the issue should be leading the solutions to solve those problems and those issues. They shouldn't just have a seat at the table, they should be running the table. And I truly believe in that, and that's what's driven me in my organizing career. And, you know, I was what I would always say, someone who just really didn't trust in the political process. I didn't grow up as a political person. My parents were not political. I didn't really understand electoral politics, really. I knew you're supposed to vote, you know, but I had never seen representation. I'd never seen anybody who I felt was fighting for me and my family and the things that we were going through. And so that kind of drove me as an organizer. You know, I really believed in organizing and putting pressure on elected officials and people in power to listen to everyday people and build power for working people. And I'll just share a story because there's some Bernie fans here, because it's kind of crazy how small the world is. So you have to understand that I was coming from this place of always pressuring elected officials to sit down and listen to working class people and meet our demands. Very much like what you see happening with the Black Lives Matter movement right now, where they're demanding elected officials to do something. I was in that business, right? Always on the outside, trying to get in. So CCI had made a connection with Senator Sanders when he was thinking about running for president back in late 14. It might've been early 15. I can't exactly remember. And Hugh Espy, who's the executive director of Iowa CCI, called me up. I was living in Iowa City. I was the director of the Center for Worker Justice at the time, and said, "Hey, will you help me put together this house party for this, this politician, this senator from Vermont?" And I was like, no, probably not. And he was like, "Well, let me tell you about who he is." Like, I didn't know who Bernie was. And he's like, he sounds good. He's just like, he's doing an exploratory run for president. It'd be good. And I was like, "Okay, I'll help you, but only if I can bird dog him and ask him a bunch of questions." And so he agreed. So I actually helped organize Bernie Sanders' first house party as an activist who was expecting to hold him accountable and ask him some tough questions. And the questions I wanted to ask him at the time were about the age for Social Security, student loan debt, and raising the wage to $15 an hour, which is hilarious now because those are like things that the senator is so strong on. And so I remember when I had the opportunity to ask him those things, he was sitting in a rocking chair with me, and there's like 50 people in this room before I really knew who Bernie Sanders was. And he just nailed it. He just nailed it. He answered the question straight. He didn't try to feed me some, fake answer. He told me exactly where he stood. And I was like, this is unlike someone I've ever heard from. And so I was interested, So basically, long story short is I have been fighting so that I truly believe the best way to transform this country is more people like us, more people who are, everyday people, working class people. Maybe, there's nothing wrong if you have fancy parents who have fancy connections. Those people deserve equality and justice too. But I'm kind of tired of living in a country where those people are the only people who get elected to office. I believe that working class people need to get elected to office. And so I've been working on that. You may know Mazahir Salih, who is now pro tem mayor of Iowa City. I knocked on Mazahir's door when I was organizing the Worker Center to get her involved in organizing our community. And then it was like, oh, you should run for office, right? And so I have been in this work of believing that people who look like us, act like us, talk like us, have lived like us should be our elected officials. And you don't have to be, anything other than you are, as long as you're committed to doing good for society. And so so when the senator called me to ask me to, it wasn't the senator at the time, it was Jeff Weaver, to ask me to be the Iowa State director, it's kind of, how could I say no? It was like, let's do it. Let's do politics differently. And let's try to get this, this Jewish guy elected. Let's do it. So that's how.
Those are really great stories, and we appreciate how vulnerable you all are being. This is just very, really amazing perspective. Our next question was submitted by Bashar, who is unable to join us today. He just graduated from Roosevelt High School and plans to attend Princeton University in the fall. He asks, what do you wish voters would have contributed to Bernie Sanders' campaign besides votes? Is there a way his supporters could have done more in his run for president? How can we help our preferred candidates in the future?
Wow. That's a good question. I think if we can take a step back from the presidential campaign and just think about sort of where, I know that, and I really appreciate, by the way, that you have people on here from all different, political ideologies, but I'm going to speak from the progressive movement. When we look at the progressive movement in this country, we've got a long ways to go. We have a long ways to go to making sure that the movement is inclusive, to make sure that the movement is from and led by people directly affected by the issues. And we are seeing a lot of that right now in this country today. In the last 3 weeks, we've been seeing exactly what I'm talking about. And, so the thing about voters and supporters is that you got to show up, you got to vote. That's so important. But it's the work leading up to the election and the work that happens after the election that honestly sometimes is more important than what happened on the election. And I really believe that, because a candidate, with the limited amount of time a candidate has to run a campaign, generally a candidate only has 6 to 8 months, right? you know, a candidate cannot shift society in 6 to 8 months, right? The candidate can run a really diligent field program and have the best scripts and, like, you know, do as much as we can. But at the end of the day, it's about the work that we've been doing before this moment, and are we ready for it, right? And so I think one of the things that we saw in the Sanders campaign specifically, and I'm just going to call it for what it is this really big disconnect between the older Black community and the younger Black community. And that was really hard for our campaign. We were not successful at speaking to older Black voters, and that hurt us in the end, right? And that is something that we have to wrestle with as a progressive movement. I don't believe that that was just a Sanders problem. I think it's a progressive movement problem. And so what I would say to people, you know, it's like, you can never blame voters, by the way, for a loss of a candidate. And so I just want to put that out there. So voting is very, very important, but it's the conversations you're having when you're volunteering on a campaign. Are you having deep, meaningful conversations? Are you getting into the issues? Are you making sure that people understand that, you know, just voting for this person, even if they win, really isn't going to change their life? It's going to take more than that. We're going to have to keep knocking on the door. We're going to have to keep fighting for the policies and the changes that we want long after the people we want in office are there. And someone to look at as an example of that is Representative Ocasio-Cortez. You know, she's done so much for New York, but she cannot do this alone, right? We don't have a Green New Deal yet. And so it's the constant organizing that happens after you get that leadership that's the most important to really pushing for the issues and the policies that you want to see. And so to me, that's the most important thing. And that we should be using campaigns, electoral campaigns, as a way to train ourselves on how to do that and how to organize and how to keep organizing after the election. Because it's going to take that to transform the country. And, you know, the last thing is, for those of us who have privilege, it's really important that you are leaning into uncomfortable conversations about those things. And you can't just do that around elections, because it might not be enough time for someone to digest what they're learning and to change their mind and vote a certain way. So this is like a lifelong mission. The work of social justice doesn't end on election day. And if you're truly here to, whatever vision you have for this country, you really do have to commit to it your whole life. I mean, because that's what it is about, right? It's like, how do you see yourself as a civilian and doing the best you can to transform society in the ways that you want to affect it? And that is what we need voters to be doing. Besides just voting, we need to be committed to those visions every day of the year. Sorry, there's no days off.
I'll be brief in my remarks, because I think Misty really hit it on the head. I really appreciate that question, because I think it gets down to the center of you know, the way in which we struggle at understanding voting and the electoral process. And Misty said it really well, and I'll just add to that, in that I'm a firm believer that shaming is a really ineffective way to move people to action. And so why do I say that? Because I think there's always this premise, right, that, you know, what is it, you know, folks have to, there's this obligation, right, that folks have to go vote, that they've got to show up, right? And I think, and that is the language we use, because I think that is right. But oftentimes what we forget about that, which I think Misty is really hitting on, is that we actually have a shit ton of barriers, excuse my language, to voting, right? We just saw that in Georgia. We just saw that in Wisconsin, right? We, in the state of Iowa, right now, we all know what we're debating is the governor signing an executive order to restore voting rights to Iowans with felonies. If you get a felony, you can't vote, right? So, you know, the question, what do I think voters could have done more for us? Nothing. You know, the question for me is really, what could we have done more to overcome those barriers? As an organizer, I'll just share this one story and close up on it. When I was in SEIU, we were doing a nursing home campaign in Chicago, one of the largest nursing home strike campaigns that was ever going to happen if we were to go on strike. And I remember I was training a member intern, which is basically just a worker who is at a nursing home who comes out on paid leave to work with the union. And we were going to nursing home, and she said, and it's tough, right? Because workers, you know, especially at that time, this is about 3 years ago, they did not have much history with the union. You know, many folks didn't know what the union was, and we're so saddled and busy with our lives. Think about our lives, right? If we work, you know, 8-9 hours a day, when I go home, I want to watch my Netflix, I want to take a bath, I want to drink a glass of wine. I don't want to worry about things, you know, that are really busy, right? And so the worker, I remember getting so frustrated that I was training, she said, why can't we just show up to the nursing home with a banner that says, join the union, just join, you know, just join the union, go ahead and do it. Well, how sort of lazy is that, right? You know, there are so many barriers to the things that we do in life. And I remember this thing that I'll just say is that we don't oftentimes make logical decisions in our life. We make decisions that sometimes are logical or with logic in mind, but think about any hard decision you made, whether it was that individual deciding to go to Princeton, or whether it was you deciding to run for student government, or to be, you know, do something really risky or bold. You did it because you had somebody that you had trust with, a relationship with, who pushed you, and really got down to it, and the emotion of you, the heart of you, to say, this is the right thing to do, and you've got to do it for X, Y, and Z reason. We've got to be able to have those hard and tough conversations. And when I think back on the campaign, I think about how could we have reached more people in meaningful and effective ways that would have pushed us over the edge. We won by 6,000 votes in Iowa, but why didn't we get those SDEs, right? We can have a debate about that all day long. A fun fact, AP still has not called the race. So we could still end up winning those SDEs, but you know, I think there's a lot to learn, and I think it would be sort of lazy of me and Misty, as Misty's saying, to say, voters, you should have done this. Why didn't you show up, you know, when you had this job, X, Y, and Z on caucus night? Why didn't you call out sick for that job and just, you know, come to a gymnasium and be there for 3 hours and then not get the results for maybe 2-3 days later? You know, you laugh at me, but I think we've got to take that away. This vote shaming type thing that we often do is just not effective to reach people, and certainly doesn't speak to people about getting in line to vote when there's so many barriers.
Sure. Well, you know, we really appreciate both of your perspectives on that. You know, our next question will come from Zara, a college student at the University of Georgia, and she joins us live.
Hello. So my question for both of you, whichever one either of you can answer, is that even though Sanders has suspended his presidential campaign, what steps are being taken, to your guys' knowledge, about working with Biden in regards to healthcare and climate change specifically to unite the Democratic Party?
Hi, Zara. So I actually run Senator Sanders' political action committee. So I still work very closely with them and deeply involved in a lot of this work. So I appreciate that. I'll take this one. Yeah, so, you know, when the senator dropped out or suspended his campaign, he made it very clear from the very beginning that no matter who became the nominee, he would be supporting them. So he's very committed to supporting the vice president and doing everything he can to make sure that he gets elected. One of the first things, though, is making sure that the vice president and the campaign of the vice president understand the priorities of Senator Sanders supporters, right? Because it's really important that we do come together. So we did form task forces with the vice president's team, where we nominated, you know, over 20 people to serve on 6 different task forces, climate change being one, healthcare being one, education, criminal justice, 2 others. So right now we've been in 3 months of negotiations of hardcore policy talks about, you know, where we really think the vice president needs to be. And those will be coming to a close actually at the end of this month. And those will be, you know, recommendations that we're sending to the vice president. And, you know, our hope obviously is to, we don't expect to paper over the vice president. The vice president is not going to become Bernie Sanders, and the Bernie Sanders is not going to become the vice president. But what we are hoping for is to make some movement on these key issues that you just mentioned. So for example, AOC is the co-chair of the climate change coalition. We have a Sunrise Movement leader as well on that committee. And so these are like grassroots leaders, along with Representative Pramila Jayapal from Washington is chairing our healthcare committee, right? So very serious leaders, people who we know are with us on Medicare for All, and climate change. Are we going to get all the things we want? Probably not, but it is our most it's what we're doing is to try to fight for that progressive agenda and push and push and push as much as we can. And I can tell you what, we're going to get a much better chance of doing that with the vice president sitting in the White House than we are with Trump. And so that's clear to us and to the senator. And that's what we're doing right now. Of course, if there does become a opportunity for Senator Sanders to travel safely across this country and do events in support of the vice president, or even in support of other progressive candidates that we're supporting, he'll do so. But we're not in agreement that it's safe to do that yet. I know there's a lot of talk about that because the president is going to be having his first rally this Saturday in Oklahoma, but we are not in support of that because we believe that we're still living in a pandemic. But the other thing I'll just mention is we believe that winning in November also means mobilizing progressives down the ballot. So Senator Sanders has endorsed 30 candidates, 12 I think, of which have a race this Tuesday. We've raised tens and thousands of dollars for candidates. We're organizing a day of action tomorrow if you want to make calls for those candidates in Kentucky and New York and DAs in Colorado. And that's how we believe the movement continues to fuel forward, and getting people out to vote for those candidates will help also elect Vice President Biden. So hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Our next question comes from Finn, a student who worked for Sanders' campaign in Iowa during the caucus season, and he will attend DePaul University in the fall.
Hi. So my question pertains to something Michael touched on a little bit earlier, which is that even though, we got 6,000 more votes, the SDEs after the deeply flawed recount process showed Buttigieg narrowly ahead. So my question is, how could the campaign have better anticipated that disparity between results in SDEs and popular vote and work to get that one extra SDE we would have needed?
I can take a stab, Misty. Hey, Finn, it's good to see you. What could we have done to get that extra SDE? I mean, I think it's like the phrase that was used to draft Bernie into this race, which is hindsight is always 20/20, and you can always look back and see, did we do this thing right? Did we do this thing right? Did we do that thing right? And I want to be conscious of, everybody on the call and not getting so much into the weeds. But I think, look, I'll just speak for myself, and I know there's a lot of Iowans on this call. For just the record, I've been in Iowa for 3 years. So I'm not a native Iowan, and I've not grown up with the caucus process. And I don't mean to dodge this question by just sort of putting it on the caucus. But I think it is really important to start and just name the fact from my perspective, I believe from Misty's perspective and other people's perspectives, that the caucus is just an inherently undemocratic process. It just really, really is. And so that is one of the sort of, tensions, right? You get 6,000 more votes, but you lose the state delegate equivalency. And so from just from a sort of democratic and I believe in pro-democracy standpoint, I think, one of the things that we have to do is take a hard look at the caucus and think about whether that's right. And, I'm of the view that I don't think that should be something that should continue and that we should have, reduce the barriers to actually participating in voting and casting a ballot for somebody. Just to sort of dig into the weeds, I think what you did see, and if you're somebody that really does look at electoral, maps and is really ingrained in electoral strategies, one of the things that you did notice was we did really well in urban areas, right? Cedar Rapids, Waterloo, Des Moines proper, we did really well. But we struggled in some of the rural areas. And as running a field program that was expansive, we had 300 staff on right? You know this, Ben, and other folks know this, and we had interns like Isabelle across the state. There's always a trade-off to what you do, right? So if you do something, if, for example, you hold a big rally in Des Moines, for example, you can't hold on that same night a big rally in a rural place. It is just time constraints and different things. And that's just one, small example, right? You could go the next day and hold a rally or do something else. I think there is something to say about, we did come up short in rural areas. And I wonder if, what could have happened if we had spent a little bit more time on thinking about those rural areas. But again, I always get caught in that because, there's a trade-off to that, right? We could have, shipped our organizers from Des Moines out to, rural Boone County, and what trade-off would that have happened? And I think it's really easy to look back and say, we could have done this and this and this. Let me just end with this and preparing folks. One of the things that you learn in union organizing is inoculation. And I'm sure we've heard inoculation a lot in sort of the pandemic world, which is just a vaccine. And what a vaccine is it's a little bit of a virus that you inject into your body to prepare yourself for, prepare your body for if you were to get a larger virus. And in the union world, we talk about inoculation a lot because when you're forming a union, the boss will come back and retaliate against workers. It happens almost everywhere, even if a place says they're pro-union. And what you do is you prepare that worker for that by basically naming that. And you say, look, you signing a pro-union card means that, you might face different levels of retaliation. Are you still on board to form this union? And most workers will say yes. And then in a week, there'll be some sort of retaliation, but the worker will then trust in that process and trust you more because you named that, right? I think we didn't know that, the caucus wasn't going to have the results on caucus night. But I think one of the things that I think we could have baked in a little bit more, and I don't know if Misty agrees with this, but we could have baked in a little bit more to our scripts is that inoculation of saying, look, regardless of the outcome on caucus night, we know that we're doing something historic. That the fact that we're organizing in this type of way, that you're standing up, just you on your street are standing up for $15 an hour and universal health care when you've never had anybody knock on your door, is a testament to history. And we know that there are people in power that will come out and they will try to take that from you. That there are people in power that will say that these results are invalid. They'll claim victory, even though that you right here are being victorious in your fight for this just by yourself. And that is something that I think we could have baked in more, preparing people and inoculating them for the rocky results that happened, whether it was caucus night or whether it was the sort of the Democratic consolidation on March 2nd and March 1st to support Joe Biden. And I wonder what effects that would have had, if any. So long answer, but that's a little bit of my thinking.
We face a problem in electoral organizing, which is continue to do what we know will make sure we win, but leave out tens and thousands of people, or try to transform what we're faced with in the electoral process, whether we agree with it or not, SDEs, super delegates, all of this stuff, right? And still try to win and build a more inclusive political movement. And, we wanted to get people of color and young people to caucus, which meant, making some tough decisions, because in order to get working class people who have 2 or 3 jobs, maybe a couple of kids, to make the commitment to go and caucus is really hard. Now, what we could have done is we could have just looked at the old electoral map and said, okay, well, we just got to win this. We got to win these precincts, got to win those precincts, got to win these precincts. Like, we're going to put all our resources there, all, middle class white people. Good. Let's just win the caucus like that. We could have done that. We didn't do that. We didn't do that on purpose, because we truly believe in transforming the political landscape, not only in this country, but in Iowa. And people in Iowa, working class people like my mom, who worked in a meatpacking factory in Marshalltown my whole life, she didn't caucus. Yeah. No one ever asked her to caucus. Her vote didn't matter. She lived in Tama County. No one cares about Tama County. Are you joking? Like there's not enough SDEs there, right?
Right.
But we kind of threw that notion out the window and said, no, we're actually going to spread ourselves all across this state, and we're going to invest in as many communities as we can because we believe everybody's important. So that comes with a price, right? Because we didn't just calculate based off of SDEs. We looked at popular vote. We looked at where did we really truly need to turn on and politically engage new communities to win the general. Because we knew we were not going to beat Trump with just the same old people who come and caucus. We knew we were not going to beat Trump that way. We needed to start now and investing in a new voters. And we made that commitment, and that's a risky commitment to make. And because of that, we lost by 0.1% SDE. And I still feel really good about the decision we made.
Sure,
Great.
wonderful.
We will now hear from Jose, a student at Cornell University in New York. He joins us live.
Can you guys see me? Hi.
Yeah.
Hi. So I wasn't involved in the Sanders campaign, but I am an active member of the Cornell Political Union and a competing member on our speech and debate team. And so I have a question for the both of you, right? So when addressing racial disparities in America, Senator Sanders has proposed greater measures of economic equality to improve the lives of working Americans. And he's advocated for the implementation of a single-payer healthcare system, something particularly pertinent in the era of COVID-19, which disproportionately affects Black and Latino communities. However, given that these proposals implicitly expect voters to trust the government, which is something especially difficult for minorities across the country, who too often feel we've been let down, how can Senator Sanders champion a just, more equal America?
Sure, I can take a stab. So, and just a little bit of background, on that. Misty is still with the senator. I'm not with the senator anymore. So Misty can always speak a little bit better to sort of the future of what Bernie is doing. But just from my experience, it's a really good question, right? We are, and I think it gets down to one of the things that I think a lot of us are sort of, so I'll just speak from my own perspective a little bit on this, right? What you're seeing right now.
Oops, I think Mr. Fasullo, can you hear me? I think you froze. Okay.
I'll text him.
Sure.
I'll text him really quick and just let him know, and then I'll take the question. Hey, you're frozen. Am I frozen? Can you guys hear me?
No, we can hear you. You're good. You're good.
Okay.
Go ahead,
Thank you.
Misty.
Oh,
Okay,
you
there
were
you go. Now
frozen.
he's
Sorry. I think you're unfrozen now. I'll
Okay,
go
good.
and then we'll let your internet get
Sure,
more
go.
established. Jose, thank you for that question. You're right. Like, you are so right about the senator has believed, I think, I mean, look, I can't speak for the senator, but based off of what what I've seen is that part of the mission of this movement that the senator has really been pushing is trying to push Americans and anybody who lives in this country, regardless of their status, to reimagine what government can be, right? Mm-hmm. Which is to break into and rethink. Look, we know that the government has done so many awful things. I mean, look at what we're talking about today with Juneteenth. Look at what we're talking, we think about the Black Wall Street massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The government did that, right? And so I think that in so many ways, the senator for a long time has been pushing people to think outside of what we know. And we have this amazing young representative who I keep talking about, Representative Ocasio-Cortez. She has this really inspirational video about the Green New Deal. And she says, we can be whatever we want, whatever we can see, right? Like, so the senator has always pushed for a new vision of what government is and who can be a part of it and who benefits from it. Not just the 1%, not just white people, right? But like, we have to completely dismantle what we know of government and recreate it. And no one else can do that but me and you, Jose. It ain't going to be the senator who can fix that. It's not going to be 1%. If Faz goes on and becomes the Iowa state governor, Faz is not going to be able to fix everybody's problems, right? That it's on us. We have to rethink what civics is and what responsibility of our country is. And it's on us to fix it together. And we're going to create the space to allow people who've been marginalized, pushed aside, violated, killed, you know, a chance to run this and to rethink what it could be. And that's a big thing to ask people to do. I understand that. So, you know, I think what the senator's commitment is right now to continue that vision, I've talked a little bit about this already, is his commitment to continue to build the progressive bench of electeds. So right now, out of all the candidates that the senator has endorsed in the last month, which I've been helping in that process, and we're very deliberate, 80% of those people are people of color, 60% of them are women. I think it's also important because a lot of people just say people of color. 8 of those are Black people who would be the first Black individual elected to their district. One being Mondaire Jones in New York, who would be the first openly gay Black man ever elected to Congress, right? One is, you know, Charles Booker, who in Kentucky right now is running against would be, if he wins his, you know, if he wins his primary, would be running against Mitch McConnell. You know, I mean, so we see that the best way that the senator can support transforming this country right now is making sure that the representatives and the people in power in this country look like this country and represent many people, right? And these are people who have very progressive views on all sorts of things, but firsthand know the experiences. For example, Charles Booker has had 4 of his cousins killed, murdered in the last 4 years, right? So if we need someone to talk about police reform and how we're going to take on police brutality, I think that guy has some ideas about what that could look like, right? And so the senator understands that. So getting people who are most firsthand, you know, affected by the different issues, running for office and winning those races is super important. So we're funding them. We're pushing our, you know, the senator has a 2 million person email list that we regularly use for these candidates. And I just really can't think of a better way right now in this moment where we're at for the senator to be using this huge platform that he's built in the last 6 years. So that's one huge way, you know, obviously trying to push Biden as much as we can on some of the issues we've already discussed today is also a huge piece of it. But, you know, you're right about, I appreciate the question, Jose, because I think you are right about asking, you know, people of color to trust a government who has often not only turned their back on people of color, but has actively participated in the murder and the destruction of those communities. So.
Right. I'll just briefly, I know we're at 3:57 and we're going to go to 4, but, and for some folks are on different time zones, but sorry about the internet. I was just saying, it's one of the things that I think we're struggling right now within the activist community, which is we're hearing calls for defund the police. And at the same time, folks are saying arrest, you know, those killer cops and put them in jail, right? So we're talking about, you know, ending a carceral system by also jailing folks. And so it's tough to sort of think about those things and coexist. And I think what Misty said is so right, is reimagining. We have a system right now, right? And we have to think about that system in an imaginary way, in a visionary way, while also facing the stark reality that there is medical racism, right, that exists in our healthcare system. We also want to form a new medical system, one in which anybody can be able to go to the doctor, anybody can get the care that they need. X, Y, and Z. And I'll just say one last thing, which is I think Misty is so right about talking about the internal side of things, that we've got to prop up different folks that are from different backgrounds, and whether or not their, you know, cousins have been killed or they've experienced police violence firsthand, and bring those folks into the system. I think at the same time, we have to have that internal strategy with an outside strategy of being in the streets. And Misty knows that, and Misty's talked about that nonstop, right, of being an organizer. And that's something that I think is so important. And we think of this radical thing, right? You mean we're going to have this organizing pressure all the time and that's uncomfortable and folks are going to be in the streets? No, that's really, really healthy for the democracy in the future that we want, that we both need inside players, but also the accountability and the pressure from the outside, right? Think about it with Cornell, right? You're probably sitting on a task force or a committee or in your political union, right? And you can get so far, right? You can sit at that table and there's different folks at that table that will tell you X, Y, and Z about the racist statue on your campus, or the, you know, the dorm policy, or the dorm named after somebody who's racist or served in the Confederacy. But you also need the movers and the pushers and the outside pressure of the folks on the street to reform that system and think about that in an imaginary way, while also you being at the table pushing for those reforms. And that's how we get these things, right? We saw in Iowa, they just passed, you know, it's not the best, but they just passed a police reform bill in 90 minutes, right? They were so scared of organizers sitting in the rotunda of the Iowa Capitol that they got their crap together like that and passed this bill, right? There's some flaws to it, but that was not on the table before, and that's because of the organizing pressure, along with allies that were in the Capitol, Ross Smith, KO, you know, and different folks. So a little bit of an answer there.
So, Ms. Rebik, Mr. Fasullo, I know we're pushing 4 o'clock. We have a couple of questions left in the lineup. Is it possible for us to get to them, or are both of you kind of hard pressed for time?
I'm good.
I'm good. I just have to reply to a text, so I'm not trying to be
That's
rude,
totally
but
fine.
let's keep going. Yeah.
Totally fine. Okay, so you know, while you're responding to that, let me introduce our next people. I'd like to introduce Alicia and Elishaba, 2 sisters from Norwalk, Iowa. Alicia is a rising sophomore at Valley High School, and Elishaba is a student at Bergman Academy. If you guys wouldn't mind turning on your cameras.
Hi. Our question is, generally Democrats are supportive of diversity and women of color. So mostly, like, our question is, how come Tulsi Gabbard, a woman of color, the first Hindu woman to Congress, and a real progressive candidate like Mr. Sanders, didn't get much support from Democrats? Was it like her anti-war stance, or were there other factors into that?
Misty, I don't know if you still have to respond to that text, and if the internet goes out here again, just take over. But I don't know. I don't really know, you know, why Tulsi Gabbard herself didn't, you know, gain that traction. I do think let's think about this, right? Because I think let's demystify the electoral and political process. The same things that you like about, and I'm a gay person, so bear with me on this, about, you know, cheering for sports, or the same things that you like about your day-to-day decisions about things, are also decisions that influence the way in which you support or engage with a campaign. So let me just back up for a minute and talk a little bit about some of those principles. For example, I don't watch a lot of baseball, but when I do, I generally cheer for the underdog. I like somebody who's an underdog in the process or the game, and that attracts me. I could care less who the other person is. If somebody's playing the Yankees, I'll support somebody who's playing the Yankees, or if somebody's playing the New England Patriots, X, Y, and Z, right? We're naturally drawn to people, and I think especially for me, having gone through, you know, my own identity fight and having to come out in a process that was really hard, I really want to cheer on and fight for an underdog. The other thing is we want to be a winner, right? Nobody wants to be a loser. Nobody wants to join something that isn't gaining steam or momentum or ground, right? It's why as things, you know, go along, you're like, yes, I'm into that, right? 5 months ago, a lot of folks would say, I don't know Charles Booker. I couldn't tell you who he is, what he's doing. He's got no chance. I'm just not interested, right? It's uncomfortable to do something and take on something that isn't gaining steam. You don't want to seem like a lone person, right? But as something gains steam, you jump on board. I think, and I can't speak a lot to Tulsi Gabbard, but I can speak to Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders was in a unique position of having gained that momentum, of having gone up in a 2-person race in 2016, essentially a 2-person race in 2015, 2016, had the name recognition. And if you really think about Bernie Sanders, you might say to yourself, yeah, I wish he was more nuanced about this issue. I wish he spoke a little bit more to the particulates of this thing, or he said this thing a certain way. But Bernie Sanders himself knows something that has always sort of struck me, which I think we talk a lot about, but we don't know how to engage with, which is how do you mainstream a message and speak to people that don't know those issues or don't know the particulates of that, but you can just simply say, yes, I want a healthcare system where everybody's in, nobody's out. I'm not saying I want Medicare for all who want it, an 8-point plan of this X, Y, and Z. I'm speaking to something that's very clear and concrete. And so that was something very unique about Bernie Sanders, is saying, instead of this, 30-page thing about climate change, no, we need to prosecute fossil fuel companies and executives, and we need a Green New Deal, right? And I can latch onto that and say, I know that, I can speak to that, I can have a conversation with somebody about that, and it's not this convoluted thing. So let me just sum all that up by saying, I think you've got to think about those things of, a lot of you probably on this call didn't support Tulsi Gabbard, or maybe there was somebody, and think about, why did I not support that? Or why did I not choose to do that thing, right? And I think the answer is not this mystified box of all these, different things, right? I'm sure there's some nuance and complexity to it, but actually it's quite more simply, which is, I didn't really know Tulsi Gabbard. She wasn't picking up much steam. And, I knew Bernie Sanders, and I was inspired by the groups of people that came along and fought with him. And the last thing I'll say about that is, in organizing, the root of organizing is building trustful relationships so you can push somebody to move them to action, whether that's buying an ice cream cone, or whether that's voting for somebody, or whether that's forming a union. And we have to think about that, right? And we knew that, and it's why so many campaigns talk about friend-to-friend organizing. Friend-to-friend organizing isn't some new crazy thing. It is a simple notion that if your friends are for something, you're going to be dragged along to do that thing, right? When I was in college, I learned about Bernie Sanders because there was a group of friends of mine and people that I didn't know writing chalk on a sidewalk in Rogers Park, Chicago, about Bernie Sanders, right? And I was drawn to that because those were relationships and people and neighbors of mine that were pulled me into that. So you have to think about that as we think about candidates and different things of, who friends influence friends, relationships influence relationships. I don't know if there was that base of relationships for Tulsi Gabbard. It probably wasn't there because she didn't do quite well.
Can I just ask a clarifying point? Are you asking, when you say, why wasn't she supported by Democrats, are you talking about like the DCCC, or are you talking about elected officials who are Democrats and like the party structure, or are you talking about voters who identify as Democrats, or maybe both?
Mostly the DNC.
Got it. That's what I thought. I was wondering. So, I think women and people of color are still having a hard time breaking in to get the support they need to win races. And, at this moment, if you want to run for Congress or president, say, you really, what it means is you got to know how to raise millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars. And most people, they expect you to do that by just picking up your cell phone and going through your own phone book and calling the people you know and asking them to donate the max donation that they can to you, right? $2,500 in a presidential, and non-presidential is a lot bigger than that generally. So if you can't do that, then you're out of luck, right? Until there was this candidate named Senator Bernie Sanders, who created a new way how to run, which is grassroots donations, expecting real everyday people to fund the campaign so that he would not have special interests and do behind the closed door, deals, right? So no one until Bernie Sanders was able to run successful campaigns that way. Bernie tapped into something and was able to make something explode. And then you've seen other candidates, try to copy that. Elizabeth Warren did this time around. AOC did, Rashida Tlaib does, Ilhan Omar does. Some of the candidates who the senator is supporting right now do. But generally speaking, that's really, really hard. And the thing that no one wants to talk about when we talk about politics is you can't run a successful campaign right now without having money. It takes a lot of money to run a good campaign because you got to pay staff, and staff are very expensive, especially good staff. And you got to get on TV. You got to have printed materials. We had 22 field offices in the state of Iowa alone. Our field offices alone had a budget, right? So this stuff costs money and it costs resources. And if you are not someone who can put forward a solution of how you're going to raise all that money and do it, people in the establishment just don't take you seriously. Right. And to be very honest, people didn't take Senator Sanders seriously because of that back in 2014 and 15 when he started to do all this. So we have come a long ways in showing what is politically possible by funding your own campaign. but it's really hard. You got to like figure out how to tap into it and do it. And so if you are not able to demonstrate that to mainstream players, they're really not going to be interested in your race because they know that your plan to win involves a plan to raise money. And if you don't have a serious plan to raise money, you're not going to get that support. And you know what? I'm just going to be honest with you. No one wants to talk about that side. We all want to talk about the issues and where you come from and all these like things that make us feel good. But the reality is we live in a country that requires people to raise millions and millions of dollars to get elected, which makes people often have only one choice, which is to take money from corporations or wealthy people, wealthy and well-connected people. And until we seriously rehaul the way in which we do elections in this country, which I believe they should be publicly funded, that's always going to be the case. So the people who have the best connections and can demonstrate to the DNC that they can, raise this money are going to get that establishment backing. And that's just how it works. And so that is why, we have to continue to explore different ways of doing politics, and we have to take the hard road. And frankly, Tulsi just wasn't able to get there, in this election. But, I want to acknowledge something else. I know we're going way over time, but, I would be remiss not to acknowledge that Tulsi is also, a woman of color, and women and non-traditional people who are, whatever, that's probably not the right way of saying it, people who are not white cisgendered men who decide to run for office always have more obstacles. Yeah. And that is that is the way it is. And it's gonna be like that for a long time because we actively live in a racist, patriarchal society. So as much as we all want to push us and have a different society, you cannot get there without acknowledging that we're living in a world that operates off of those things. So how do we succeed in that world while pushing the world to be the thing we want it to be? And so, people of color and women and non-traditional candidates are always just going to have a tougher time. And that's why the organizing aspect that Michael brought up, the grassroots organizing, figuring out your message, figuring out how to create a chispa, we would say in Spanish, right? Like a flame. You got to bring something special because you're got to depend on the people to get you elected. And if not, then you're probably not going to have a very successful chance because you're going to need millionaires otherwise, right? So that's kind of my take.
Great. Our next question was submitted by Julian, a student at Bergman Academy. For him, one of his biggest worries for the future is climate change. His questions are, why are there so much resistance to shifting to solar and renewable energy sources? Do you think that we will be able to overcome the non-earth friendly policies that have been put in place in the last few years?
Yeah, I think so. I think anything's possible. I wake up every day choosing the hardest fights. I decided to run the Iowa State campaign for Bernie Sanders. I guess I'm kind of like Michael. I enjoy working for the underdog because maybe I was an underdog. I come from that. I was the first person in my family to go to college. My mom dropped out of high school. My dad was barely high school educated. So, I've always been an underdog and I really believe anything is possible. I really, really do believe that. I know it's cheesy, but I guess maybe that's what I need to keep fueled up. But look, there's always going to be resistance around any of this until we can deal with concentrated wealth that has control of our government. So I hate to go back to the same thing you heard me say, but until we figure out how to get more working class people who are not tied to special interests into office, it's going to be very difficult to make the kind of change we need to really truly tackle climate change. And the reality is, I think what we know, and there's more, I'm not a climate change expert. I'm more a workers' rights and gender justice and sort of expertise on that side. But what I will say is that I just think we haven't thought big enough about climate change. And I think the Green New Deal is one of the best things I've seen, but I think we've got to even go bigger than that, right? Which goes to one of the questions that Jose asked, how do you ask the electorate, how do you ask people to think beyond what they've ever seen or imagined? And that's what we have to do with climate change. So, I think there's resistance to all that because fossil fuel companies have a lockdown on Congress, frankly. We just got to keep fighting. We got to keep fighting for the truth. We got to keep fighting to educate is not quite the right word, but agitate people around this issue. Because, you know, for some people, they don't worry about it because they don't think it's really going to affect them because they might be dead by then, right? Like, but I got to think about it. You got to think about it. So we have to figure out how to break people out of that box. And it's going to be on all of us all the time, having those tough conversations, getting comfortable being uncomfortable, and having tough conversations with your grandparents and your parents and your aunts and your uncles, no matter what side they are on politically, and just, you know, pushing for it. We've got to demand it. Yeah.
Great. So, you know, to save time, this next one will be our final audience question, and we're going to kind of mash together 3 questions students have submitted that kind of fall along the same lines. So those 3 students are Weston Wise, Michael Mitchell, and then also Adrian from Johnston High School. So, you know, the question I'll ask you, which essentially mashes together the 3 that they were asking, you know, in various instances within the campaign, for example, when Pete Buttigieg edged out Senator Sanders, or when you saw moderate candidates beginning to coalesce around Vice President Biden, you know, when those lows within the campaign came about, you know, what was it like from your perspective? And, you know, overall, regardless of the highs and the lows, walking away from this campaign, what have you really learned personally?
I can take a stab. I'm interested to see what Misty says. I always like hearing from her and then formulating my thoughts. But what were those moments like? Let's just zoom out for a second. I think one of the things, and maybe this is a learning lesson as well, one of the things that I learned that is really tough on a campaign is you've got an audience, right, that's watching news, that's consuming media and articles and different things, and they're able to experience a moment on your campaign or during a campaign cycle a lot differently than you. And one of the hardest things I think about is it is really hard to take a step back in a campaign and understand what's happening in real time. Sometimes it's really difficult. And so those moments when they were happening, so let's talk about caucus night, you know, we're trying to digest that at the same time that folks on the outside are able to digest that, while also having to work within that and do 50 million things. Let's talk about the coalescing of moderate candidates. That was another moment. I remember Misty actually called me that night. I was serving as the state coordinator in Michigan, and Misty was in DC working with the organizing department, leading the organizing department. And she called me and she was like, Pete Buttigieg is dropping out. And we both were sort of trying, I'm in the checkout trying to get a bite to eat while I'm also on, you know, getting texts about different things, right? Misty's on the phone with me. We have this quick 5-minute convo, and Misty's like, what do you think? What does that mean, right? You know, we're trying to understand this at the same time, whereas, you know, we're also doing a million things, and you don't quite know, what is happening during those times. And so it's always interesting. I remember when the campaign ended, you sort of look back and you're able to consume stuff and say, oh yeah, what if we did that at this different time? And I'm not speaking to the fact that, you know, some folks would say, well, they really need a process where they're able to step back and think about things and evaluate. We had that, right? We did that a lot, and that was very key to our campaign. I think why we ended up in the position we were. If you remember, in September of 2019, before February 3rd of the caucus night, we were actually 4th in the polls in Iowa, right? So we did a lot of work to get us to a different point. One of the biggest lessons that I have around, the campaign in general and working on it is, and it's hard to sum up because there's so many different levels of thinking about it, but is that, there are limits and constraints to our electoral system is the takeaway that I have, right? We saw that in Wisconsin and other places. I think the other thing is, one of the things that was so frustrating to me leaving, one of the things was the articles that paint a broad, stroke of a brush around different things, such as we didn't see youth voter turnout, or we didn't see this thing happening, or Bernie Sanders should have done this, or blah, 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 right? And one of the biggest takeaways for me is that there's a lot of fight in people. And there's a resiliency, and there are people who have never been asked to do something before that are willing to step up and take action. And all you got to do is ask them. And in our processes and in the process of organizing and asking people en masse to step up, it's messy. And you see a lot of different things, but there's a lot of beauty in that mess. And so as we head into 2020 with this general election coming up, we have what some may call a tumultuous sort of society right now. I'm actually really inspired by it because I think I was so afraid at the end of our campaign that people would give up and they would just say, this is not worth it. And you see that. But I think what we're actually seeing, and I saw in Michigan and I saw in Iowa, is just regular working people saying, excuse my language, but fuck this. This is not it. This is not what it is, and we can do better. And you all are a testament to that. I think a lot of you probably got involved or are on this call because you had a moment in your life where you had to realize that this is just not worth it. And you have a deep level of fight in you. And it just takes somebody asking you to step up, or somebody waking you up, or tragically a sad event like George Floyd's passing to say, this is enough, I'm getting in the streets, I'm doing this. And we saw that on different levels of the campaign. And so I never want folks, and I include myself in this, to be in a point of despair and say, we just can't do it, because we can. And, our systems of power exist on the thought that we can't ever achieve something. And the quote from Nelson Mandela that Bernie often butchered or said on the campaign, and I might butcher, is that, something always seems impossible until it's done. And we can't forget that. And I know that sounds really cliche, especially for those of us that struggle with systems of oppression, whether in our own lives or just systemically. But that's something that we have to just really hold on to. And so thank you for this call, and thanks for all these questions. I really, really appreciated it. Misty.
Thanks, Michael. So I just jotted down some of the key things that I tried to bring to the team. But before I do that, I just want to say, I don't think I can overestimate, how the last 16 months of my life has just changed dramatically. So I was working for a nonprofit in Iowa City. I had a house. And then within 16 months, I had rented my house out, moved to Des Moines, got an apartment, became the Iowa State director, won the caucus, in my opinion, since the AP hasn't called it. Got a call, was told to be in DC and take over the organizing department. So then I was in DC and I was running the organizing department. And then we won New Hampshire, then we won Nevada, then we lost South Carolina. And then, right before Super Tuesday, the moderates all come together. They kind of take our legs out from under us. And then coronavirus happens. Yeah. And then I have to help lead the entire strategy for how are we going to manage. We had 500 people all across the country organizing. How do we take care of them? How do we take care of our staff? How do we take care of our supporters? Make sure people are healthy, make sure people get home okay. All the different things. When do we decide to stop doing events? When do we start doing it? So then I had to go through all of that in April, in March, and then in April we suspended, right? So a lot has happened, and now I work for Senator Sanders, and I'm in DC. And I just want to say, if you are watching this, I assume it's because you're interested in politics. And one of the best things you can do for yourself is go work on a campaign. And the reason you can do that is because you're going to push yourself. You're going to go through things you never thought you would be able to go through. You're going to learn your own limits. I used to tell Michael, because Michael managed a huge team, I used to say, look, people show up differently under pressure. You're going to learn how you show up under pressure. And then once you know how you show up under pressure, you'll work on how you show up under pressure, right? And so you need to go work on a campaign, try it out. I'm not saying you need to be a lifelong operative, but you will learn so much about yourself. And more importantly, you will learn a lot about people. You will learn a lot about everyday working people, and you're going to learn a lot about voters, and you're going to learn a lot about your colleagues. And, titles are good, but purpose is better. That's something that our co-chair, Senator Nina Turner, said all the time. I cannot stress that enough. I know you're going for big titles. Congratulations to everybody who's getting into colleges and going off and doing amazing things. But at the end of the day, it is your purpose that is going to make you feel fulfilled, right? And I find a lot of purpose personally by being surrounded by people who I can grow with, who I can go through conflict with, who we can have compassion with each other. And together we're committed to something. We have a shared vision and a shared mission. And so just remember that no matter how high up you get in anything, you will only be as special and you will only get the respect from people around you based off of how you show up. Your title is great, but purpose is better. And lead through vulnerability. There's nothing more disheartening than knowing that someone's lying to you, right? When someone is not being honest with you, when you need moments of truth. And so I dedicated myself to telling as much truth and transparency as I could on the campaign. And I also led through vulnerability. There were moments when I did not have the answers, and it would have been fake, and it wouldn't been right to go in and tell everybody I had the answers. Now, there's also moments when you fake it till you make it. And don't forget that either. But you never fake it if you don't really know, you know? If you don't know the answer to something, don't fucking make up an answer to it, right? But sometimes you do. You gotta like have some confidence and some air about you, and you gotta like run stuff, because the reality is people here in DC, people all across the country have been doing this stuff. They don't know either. Yeah. They don't know either, you know? So you got to fake it till you make it, but you also got to lead through vulnerability and admit when you're having a tough time with things and ask people to come in and help you, and let's solve this together. And that's going to go a really long ways for you. And the last thing I will just say is that, you know, I didn't really know it at the time because, you know, I just kind of told you the trajectory of the last 16 months of my life. But, you know, building a team of courageous young people. By the way, I'm 34. I'm turning 34 tomorrow. So I'm almost 10 years older than Michael. But, you know, building a team of young people and learning so much from people of all different ages. We had a senior advisor who is well into his 50s, who I learned from every day, and he learned from me every day. You know, having that humble ability to learn from people who look different than you, who have different life experiences than you, who might be younger than you, who might be older than you, might have a different gender than you, or a different gender identity, is so important. And I was just given the most amazing opportunity to work with all of the volunteers, the supporters on this call, people like Michael, who, you know, I know that whenever I'm on my deathbed, whenever that is going to be, this will be one of the things I remember for the rest of my life. It was truly transformative. So I'm just grateful for the movement.
You know, as we close today, I just wanted to quickly share a brief story with everybody listening as to how all of this came about. And I think that Senator Sanders ties in, you know, into how, you know, in 2018, as the midterm elections were coming, Iowa loved this really tense gubernatorial election, as, you know, both of our guests know, because they were a part of that. And around the summer of 2018, as the general election really started, you know, I had come up with the idea of organizing a student-run debate featuring Governor Reynolds and Fred Hubble. You know, from the research that I had done, it hadn't really been done at a general election level. And so we were really interested in making it happen, because oftentimes the issues that are important to young people are often left outside of the important conversations we should be having. So, you know, with the support of my school district, you know, I would spend time between classes and oftentimes during classes, you know, in the stairwell of my school, calling campaign offices and staffers, you know, trying to get the candidates on board. I deepened my voice to sound more professional so that, you know, they would take it more seriously. You know, and along the way, I learned a lot about the political process and how it works, and more so how it doesn't. You know, eventually we were able to get both candidates on board to, you know, take part in a forum. And then hours before we were about to announce it, suddenly one candidate pulled out because it was the week before the race, and suddenly a really big surrogate was coming to town to campaign for them. So that was obviously very devastating, because dozens of hours had gone in. So after the 2018 races, the attention turned to the Iowa caucus in 2020. we had so many different candidates coming to Iowa, trying to get in front of voters. And I came up with the idea of recreating this as something that we would do with presidential candidates. And, once again, I had the support of my school district. We got the Register to sign on as a co-sponsor, and they armed me with a list of, campaign contacts. And there were over 24 different candidates at the time. So, I was calling staffers, trying to log in my mind, okay, I need to follow up with them on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Essentially it came down to me realizing that we needed a big name candidate in order for this kind of thing to happen. And at the time, we weren't really being treated seriously by most of the big name candidates, because the first thing people would ask when they picked up the phone was, who else is participating? And when we didn't have another big name on there, usually they weren't that interested. So I remember I connected with somebody named Joseph Fahey from the Sanders campaign. And, from the very start, he took everything very seriously, what we were saying. And it came down to it that it was September 2nd or September 3rd, I believe, and it was a Friday. And I was in a car coming home from school. And at that point, I was essentially resigned to the fact that this may not happen, or that if it did, it wouldn't have the big name candidates we were looking for, and students may not be interested. And I remember I got a call from Mr. Fahey's number. And before I answered it, I was silently praying to myself that, please let this be good news. I picked up the phone and he said, so the senator can participate in the event. And that was, the complete turnaround, where suddenly when we called back other big name candidates upon saying Bernie Sanders was participating, suddenly they gave it another look. And, I can really say without a doubt that is really what made the 2020 Youth Voice Forum at Roosevelt High School last September happen. And that's where all of this has come from, because that we decided to continue this series as all of us are in lockdown. So, that's really what I think the campaign was all about, from what I've seen from an objective, nonpartisan perspective. That's what elevating youth voice is about. That's why we're all here. Every single one of our guests from both sides of the aisle over the last 2 weeks has taken the time to hear our questions, to respond to our concerns. They've inspired us. They've motivated us to get involved. And I'll give you the same message that I gave at the start of this call. Please register to vote. If you're not able to do so, please try to get somebody else to register. No matter where you are on the political spectrum, I think all of us would really like to see some changes. And I think that with our voices, we can make that happen. So, Ms. Rebik, I would like to thank you so much. Mr. Fasullo, I'd like to thank you so much. Ellie Miglin has been a fantastic co-host over the last 2 weeks. It's been a true honor and a privilege to host these forums alongside her. I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to take part in these last 2 weeks, particularly those of you who have joined every single forum. This may not be the last one, because Ellie and I are looking at potentially doing something ahead of this year's congressional and Senate races later on in the summer. So stay tuned. You may be getting an email about that from us. But until then, we'd like to express our sincerest gratitude. We thank all of you. We hope you will stay safe in these turbulent times. And thank you so much for elevating the youth voice. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. It was very good to be here.
Thank you. Yes, just congratulations on such a successful cycle. You guys are amazing.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you
Take
for your
care.
time today. Good night.
Yep.